Thank you all for being here today, and thanks for being part of SunFest and the Colorado Sun's, we hope to be, annual festival. This is our first launch, and so please give us your perspective afterward, how things went, what you were most interested in. We had a great EV panel this morning, and they're still parked outside in the circle if after this you want to go check those out. Classic cars converted to electric by some great creators. And now we have a great panel on transportation, the future of how Colorado moves. And we've got some of the top policy leaders and operational leaders in Colorado here to talk to you from their perspective and to take your questions. We have a hard stop at 11:50 because our keynote's going to be back in here with Connor Hall and Jason Blevins on outdoor issues in Colorado. And so we'll try to stop a few minutes before that to make sure. If you have a burning question about something that happened and you want to ask it right away, just raise your hand. Danica Worthington, another great Colorado Sun staffer, is here to help with the microphone, and you can help us all out by talking into the microphone because that works for our podcast and video recording. So we appreciate that. With us today on the panel, we have Dan Blankenship, who is the chief of the Roaring Fork Transportation Authority, serving the Roaring Fork Valley. People who are based down here don't know how big they are. One of the largest rural transportation systems in the entire country, not just in Colorado. How many millions of passenger trips was it this year or last year, Dan?
Well, I think this year we're looking at being close to 5 million.
5 million passenger trips, 700,000 or 800,000 regular passengers, more than 5 million service miles on a stretched out couple of counties and towns, and serving everybody from the people who are doing all the hard work in Pitkin County and the surrounding communities, to tourists, to all kinds of folks, bike trails, new bike share program that we're going to talk to Dan about, that they're about to be launching, and get some more details on that. Debra Johnson, head of RTD, really needs no introduction. Obviously, RTD serves 3 million people in the metro area for transit, with buses, with individual rides, with Access-a-Ride, with a very impressive network light rail train system and commuter rail train system and the airport train that is the envy of a lot of people in the country and sometimes not as well used in the metro area as it should be. And she has served in an amazing number of communities with similar challenges and similar advantages, from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, Long Beach, San Francisco, Debra, and served in operational executive capacity in all those places as well. So she can talk about that experience and the idea of a transit agency having to do a lot of social services these days and getting involved in affordability and what to do in public spaces. And Will Toor also probably doesn't need a lot of introduction in Colorado, is currently head of the Colorado Energy Office, which is a funnel for a lot of the policy and the money that comes from the federal government and the state government in terms of electrifying Colorado, working on air pollution issues, working on the greenhouse gas goals and targets that Colorado has put into state law. And Will gets involved in transportation, obviously, but also in building and industrial pollution, all kinds of other things. And he's here to talk about any of those, but he's also been mayor of Boulder, on the Boulder County Commission, has served on the Air Quality Control Commission, Oil and Gas Commission. Did I miss any other commissions, Will?
I was never actually on the Oil and Gas Commission.
Oh, okay.
I was on the Oil and Gas Task Force.
Task Force, okay. But knows all those issues backward and forward. And the bicycle helmet he brought today is not just for show. He's got the healing broken bones to prove how much he's been all over Colorado on the bike and on his legs. So obviously has been involved in issues. And I think I've seen online, you take all these amazing personal transit loops where you bike one place, train back, hike somewhere else, and climb somewhere else. So he's always connecting his own forms of personal transit. The topics that we can talk about today are many and can take more than an hour. We want to hear your contributions, but let's start off by talking about electrification. We'll maybe take that one first in terms of how is our commuting life, our road life, our public life going to be different in the next 10 years because of the electrification of all the systems that are going on in Colorado right now?
So great question. I have to start for riffing off of your comments by telling you the absolute best backcountry trip without having to drive that I've done in Colorado. It's the RTD bus from Boulder up to Eldora, skiing up to the Gwin Mountain Hut, free hut that the Colorado Mountain Club maintains, then over Rollins Pass the next day down to Winter Park, ski train back into the metro area, sitting in a bar car. It's the best thing you could imagine. But with that, I think there's a lot of really exciting action happening when it comes to transportation electrification. Electrification isn't the only thing we need to do, but it's one of the things that we do need to do in order to tackle our air pollution challenges and get to our science-based state goals of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the middle of the century. That means that we need to transform essentially the entire vehicle fleet to electricity. And a few years ago, that seemed incredibly daunting. I remember back in 2019 when we adopted a goal of basically 1 million EVs on the road in Colorado by 2030, people were like, you guys are crazy, that's just not going to happen, because it was a really ambitious goal based upon where the industry stood at that time. But what we've seen is this remarkable progress that is happening in the automotive industry, both for cars, but also increasingly for trucks and buses, where essentially the cost of batteries has come down dramatically. If you looked back a few years ago, it was $1,000 for essentially a kilowatt of lithium-ion batteries. You're now down to below $100 for that same level of battery. And that is just making electrification possible at a scale that people didn't really think could happen. And so I'm now quite confident that we really are headed towards achieving that goal of 1 million EVs by the end of this decade. If you look at what's been happening with market share in Colorado, when I took this job in 2019, market share was a little over 2%. As of the last quarters that I was looking at, it was up to about 13.5%. And the last month's data that I looked at, it still needs to be quality checked, but it had gone up to 17%. Wow. If you look at what's happened in places like China and some of the European countries, what we've seen is that once you hit around 15 to 20%, you really hit this tipping point where you're on a one-way track to electrification. So I really think that that's where we're headed in Colorado.
So we're breaking news here. We're up to close to 17% of current new car sales in Colorado, and like trucks, being electric or plug-in hybrids, which also qualify as ultra-low emissions.
Yeah. With the one caveat that that's the most recent month's data, so we haven't quality checked it yet.
We'll check on it. But that's still, it's the ramp is going up, and I've questioned Will in the past about whether that 930,000 on the road by 2030 is possible, and apparently we are on track for that. Okay. Charging stations. All those electric vehicles need people to plug in, places for people to plug in order to get rid of range anxiety, make the system work. So how are we doing on that?
So we're doing pretty well. The first thing to remember about charging is that for most people, they do most of their charging at home. How many people here have an EV? Anyone? So am I right? Do you do most of your charging just plugging in at night at home? It's one of the great things about having an EV. So I have a plug-in hybrid, and I'm able to do all my local driving on electricity, and it is so nice to essentially never have to go to a gas station unless I'm on a long-distance road trip. It's so easy to just come home, plug in. However, that's a challenge for folks who live in multifamily housing, and there's a reason that early adoption of EVs has largely been folks who live in single-family homes who have access to a garage or carport where they can charge. So that's one of the areas that there's a big focus on in the state, and that we need to continue to focus on, is making sure that there's charging available for folks who live in condos and apartments and townhomes, that they have access to EVs also. The legislature last year actually passed legislation that sets minimum EV-ready charging requirements for any parking that is provided in multifamily housing. So starting next spring, any new construction or major remodels of multifamily housing will have to include, I believe it's 60% of whatever spaces are provided will have to have some form of either charging or pre-wiring for those vehicles. And then we also need to have publicly available charging, especially fast charging along corridors and at major destinations like airports and ski areas. And that's a place where there's a lot happening in Colorado. Some of it comes from the federal government. The Infrastructure Act allocated us $57 million to support charging infrastructure, but a lot of it actually comes from state funding. We're going to have about $400 million of state funding to invest in EV charging between now and the end of the decade, and also electric utilities. So the legislature a few years ago required our electric utilities to develop transportation electrification plans that support widespread access to electric vehicles. And so we're starting to see utilities put sort of real levels of investment into supporting their customers in building a wide range of charging, including charging for fleets. So there's a lot that needs to happen there, but I'm pretty confident that we're on the track to have the charging that we need to support that widespread electrification.
Speaking of the federal government, Debra is taking phone calls in between talking from the shutdown of the federal government, which is apparently about to happen unless something has happened in the last 15 minutes. May not affect RTD's operations very much at the moment, but obviously a lot of federal involvement. Debra, you are providing rides for folks who we all want to participate in electrification. We all want them to have access to automobile rebates if they can afford them. You are also serving people who can't afford them or don't want to travel that way. What are the biggest challenges right now for RTD in terms of electrifying its system, and continuing to improve its system, continuing to achieve the ridership you need to keep supporting the system, and then being able to expand it in the future as people demand more and more transit?
Thank you very kindly for the question, and more importantly, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel this morning. It's my pleasure. So recognizing the one thing about public transport, when we talk about utilizing a commercial vehicle, while everybody's laser focused on electrification, I look at it through a different lens, because regardless of a propulsion system, a mass transit vehicle can help reduce greenhouse gases, even if it's diesel, because we are removing single occupant vehicles, from the road. So with that as a backdrop, as we talk about RTD service area, we have a service area of 2,342 square miles. And as you said in the introduction of me, that I've come from areas in California, and I can say that I was part of the innovative clean transit regulation in the state of California, whereby the California Air Resources Board said that any large transit provider had to be alternatively fueled, zero emission by 2040. And so I was greatly involved in those discussions. So with that being said, as we talk about electrification, one could use a CNG vehicle and have a near zero NOx engine that would emit 0.001 of a particulate, right? So as we talk about what we're doing holistically, we have to ensure that we have infrastructure in place. As we look at RTD as a whole, our youngest facility is like 36 years old. And when you think about the transition to a varying propulsion system, we have to ensure that we have the resources in place. And what I mean by that, it's not just having somebody that knows how to operate a bus, be it, hybrid, be it hydrogen fuel cell, be it, CNG, LNG, or what have you. We have to ensure it's a new way of doing business, and we have to change that model. So with that being said, we also have to keep in mind that in this country, we do have federal requirements as relates to how we procure vehicles, being a recipient of federal dollars. And doing so, we also have to adhere to Buy America. There's only 2 bus manufacturers in this entire country that are approved by the FTA being the Federal Transit Administration, to manufacture said vehicles. So when you think about that holistically, there's the state of California, the entire state, that has probably in excess of about 300 transit agencies in their state that are going full steam ahead with various bus procurements. And as we sit here, a diesel bus costs about, it depends, $600,000 to $700,000, but a battery electric bus, a one-for-one, would be about $1.1 million, but we have to have that infrastructure in place. So I provide that context to say that RTD is all the way in, but we need to have a plan and we have to be intentional. And the agency just embarked upon a facilities, and I put facilities ahead of fleet because it's for not if I have nowhere to store our vehicles. And then we have to think about the environment in which we're in, unlike the areas in which I've come from, because we have to think about the drain on the battery as it relates to our HVAC systems. We also know from operating 36 battery electric buses currently along the 16th Street Mall that there's greater battery degradation as we go full steam ahead. So as we look 10 years down the road, I think collectively there will be a lot more data that can help inform how we utilize these systems. I come from a place where we had inductive charging. We tested that. That didn't work too well for us because basically you have to work with jurisdictions to ensure that you have that ability to place that infrastructure on somebody else's right-of-way. So holistically, yes, I qualify it as zero emissions, can change the trajectory, but we have to be intentional, especially as we're looking at our operating environment, because when you see one transit agency, you see one transit agency, and you have to be careful you're not comparing apples to fish. But we're committed as we look to see what we can do holistically, and it may be gradual, and it's going to take us some time as we have in excess of 1,000 transit vehicles. And more specifically, most people don't know that we contract out 50% of our bus operations. So then we have to think about those third parties with whom we engage.
One of the biggest things that's happened for transit statewide in the last couple of years is the free fare program, working with the state on that in order to provide the money to make, to backfill that revenue that the transit agencies give up when they give away things for free. Can you talk a little bit about, from RTD's perspective, this year it was 2 months this summer instead of just 1 month. That's significant, 2 months out of the year where you can ride transit for free. How did it go for RTD? What did you see in ridership? How do you feel it informs what you'll be doing with fares? People must ask you, why can't it be free all year? And I'm sure that makes your revenue people go red in the face. But tell us how you think it went so far this year.
Thank you very much for the question. So for everybody's edification, the Zero Fare for Better Air, in collaboration with the Colorado Energy Office, we were able to do our second year, as you indicated, with 2 months. It's very hard to provide information at this juncture. I can provide some anecdotal feedback because, as I stated in my previous response, we do contract out with third-party entities, and we have to get the data from them. So I can speak to the month of July. And so as it relates to a comparison of June 2023 to July of 2023, we saw an increase in boardings by 17% across the system. In comparison to last year, July over July, we saw an increase of 16%. Now, recognizing that there's a myriad of different factors one has to take into consideration, last year we did not have data readily available where we could say what the mode shift was. More specifically, I don't have auspices over data as it relates to the reduction in greenhouse gases. I'm looking at it through the lens of how many people changed their habits relative to leaving their single occupant vehicle at home to utilize mass transit to get to a place. More specifically, something that was very paramount was the weekend of July 15th. We had here in the Mile High City Taylor Swift Eras Tour. We had that on Friday, July 14th and Saturday, July 15th. And concurrently, there was the Rockies versus Yankees game. Now, one thing
I was stuck in that traffic picking up my son and his girlfriend from Taylor Swift. So
exactly.
Surrounded by 60,000 people in sparkling dresses.
And I'm sure they were throwing their little friendship bracelets as well.
Yes.
So keeping that in mind, what we saw from our various cameras that we have throughout the system, there were hordes of people coming toward light rail. And I have to say that was a shining moment for the Regional Transportation District. I don't have the data readily available, but I'm willing to bet my life savings. It was the higher ridership day that the RTD transportation network has had in its history. And one thing that made it easier to have people access transit was they did not have to figure out the fare structure. So that basically enabled people to utilize the system without fear or trepidation about how does this work. And one thing's for certain, I'm joined here in the audience by my colleague who serves as our Chief Communications and Engagement Officer, and he was out on the platform and he spoke with a family that has been traveling around going to every single Taylor Swift concert in the country. And they said by far their experience had been one of ease. And I state that as well because I was just asked recently by one of my sister friends who runs LA Metro to speak to a thought leader workshop about our experience relative to moving people for that concert. So I provide that anecdotal information to say the one thing that the fare does is enable people, the fare free enables people to utilize the system, because oftentimes I've learned throughout the course of my 32-year career is that there's a lot of fear in reference to trying to navigate a system of which someone knows nothing about. And when you can just go and get on without having to worry about, oh my gosh, how do I get, a fare payment card? Can I use what's in my wallet?
Am
Do I
I
have to
crossing
download
into
an
another
app?
region, and is that going to cost me $2 extra?
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's one added plus. And so I would say as well, we did not see preliminarily an uptick in any incidents. And I qualify incidents such as individuals perhaps not having a sunny disposition when they utilize our transportation services. And so, because for all intents and purposes, those that don't have a sunny disposition aren't looking at Stewart's communication campaign to say, oh, now I can stay on the bus longer. And so as we look at that going forward, it helps us as we try to be intentional. And what might this look like in the future? Well, for certain, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And while we received money from the Colorado Energy Office, in the first year, we had to have a 20% match. Ridership, for all intents and purposes, as it relates to our transit agency, we're not yielding a great source of revenue from a fare box. We provide a public service.
It's mostly sales tax, and maybe everybody doesn't know that. The
Right.
greatest portion of RTD revenue by far comes from the
From our
sales
sales and
tax.
use tax, and our fare box recovery ratio now is close to 8%. It is very analogous to most transit agencies in the country. I actually work for the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit District, known as BART, and by far they had one of the highest fare box recovery ratios at the time prior to COVID, probably yielding close to 75 to 80%, but that's changed without people going into San Francisco since you've had the change of remote work policies and things of the like.
So are you ever tempted to just say it's 8%? Let's just make it free the whole year and figure out how to backfill that 8%.
So there's a couple of things. As we talk about transportation, the operative word in what I do is public, right? And so when you think about public services holistically, do you have to pay $3 before you call 911? Do you have to pay $3 before you call the fire department? So I think it's a broader discussion relative to what it is that we're seeking holistically as a society as it relates to services. Because if in fact, if it was already embedded into some funding mechanism, it could have the appearance of being air quote free for everyone. And so recognizing where we are, we do have obligations as it relates to our financial forecast going forward. I do report to a board of directors comprised of 15 individuals that are elected directly by a constituency. So it would be up to them to set our fare policy with recommendations from a subject matter expert such as myself. Mm-hmm. And so as we look at it holistically, it's like, what are the trade-offs and what are we trying to achieve and what's the problem for which we're trying to solve?
So you're not going to break news and announce free all year round today?
Not today.
Not today.
However, before I yield the mic, I would be remiss to state that we have launched a program for zero fare for youth. And that's something that I am immensely proud of. And I say I'm immensely proud of because we are doing a myriad of different things.
So first tell us what it means. Okay, great.
I am going to get to that. So I'm immensely proud of it for the simple fact, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, and Will knows that, as we talk about providing zero fare, what we're doing here is providing fare-free options for those individuals that are aged 6 to 19 years of age, and we're doing a one-year pilot project. I'm a firm believer that public transportation is the great societal equalizer. Not all of us were born on equal footing. Recognizing that children, our future generations, are entitled to an education, and a lot of people are taking advantage of a public education. It's for naught if somebody doesn't have a means of access to get there. And I say that from the vantage point that even though RTD was providing a discount of 90 cents, if I'm a single parent and I have 4 children, 90 cents times 4 is still $3.60. Round trip is $7.20. Multiply that by 20, right? 20 days in a month. I may have to decide, am I feeding my child or am I going to get them to school? And by leveraging the Zero Fare for Youth program, not only are we investing in the future generations, we're helping to develop an environmentally sound citizen. We're helping to invest in the educational aspirations of future generations. And then doing so, we're enticing people to already have an understanding of the means of having mobility options as a sense of freedom. And so while we're doing this for a year, I would be remiss not to thank the Federal Transit Administration, because I did personally reach out to the Federal Transit Administration and ask them for an exemption, because it's guidance that we get from the federal government when we do a demonstration project. You can only do one for 6 months for fare and a year for service without doing an equity analysis, because we have to ensure that we're not creating a disproportionate burden or a disparate impact on low-income and minority populations respectively. So we were able to get a waiver to do a year, recognizing that a school year is longer than 6 months. So we're going to take that data, make informed decisions. We have had conversations with our partners in the state legislature, and I see Ann Rahinsky out here, who leads CAST of the Colorado Association of State Transportation Agencies, as we talk about what that may mean for the state of California. I stand corrected, the state of Colorado.
Colorado, yes.
I did this in California.
California should try it.
Right. As we look at it holistically for the state, so we're not picking and choosing, because every child should have an opportunity for education.
So before we get to Dan, very quickly, what is it this year? So did it start with this academic year? Are we in the middle of the year already?
So we commenced September 1st of 2023, and it will end on August 31st, 2024, the pilot. Hopefully there'll be some legislation. Get out, rally around, talk to your friends, talk to your legislators, and hopefully we can continue on with this program for years to come.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dan, let's talk, use the fare question to talk about what happened with you. Free fares was statewide. Colorado Springs took advantage of it. A lot of local agencies did. Tell us a little bit about what happened for your area. People think that, again, going back to the statistics that we talked about, people who are based down here may think that everybody arrives in Aspen on private jet, but they don't. You've got a lot of people who absolutely need transit. So what happened with your free fares, and are you able to draw any implications for your future?
Well, thank you for that question, and it's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be on this panel with Debra and with Will Toor. I had a great flight in on my private jet this morning, and
You flew right over Will on his bicycle as you came down.
we chose not to go with the fare-free program last year and this year for a number of reasons. One is that we are short of drivers, about 20% of what we need. And our ridership on our regional commuter services is only about 6% below what it was in 2019 prior to the pandemic. So, but we've had to reduce service levels because we don't have enough staff to provide our traditional levels of service. So what we're experiencing during peak periods on our long-haul commuter services is standing room only. And that's not ideal to have people standing on a bus riding 20, 30, 40 miles. So we didn't want to make that problem worse than it was, and potentially subject people to an experience that was not comfortable and might be inconvenient for them if the bus that showed up at their bus stop was full and then they had to wait to the next one and that was full. So that's why we didn't do that. But a few years ago, we changed our fare structure and we made it free to ride within a zone, and we have 8 zones from Rifle, Colorado to Aspen. It's free from within the city of Aspen. It's free within the city of Glenwood Springs. It's free between Aspen and Snowmass. And then our fares are pretty modest. For use, we charge $1 anywhere in the system, and with a discounted pass, they can ride for 75 cents. Seniors can ride free, veterans ride for half price, and people with disabilities can also ride for half price. So the only place that we really charge any fares is on our regional commuter services. And there is a lot of free service available for people. A lot of those youth trips are within a zone anyway, so it's helping them out. We would love to be able to do it at some point in the future, and we just passed a significant wage increase for our bus operators. Our starting pay now is $30 an hour, and we hope we don't poach any people from Debra, because I know she's probably got a few vacancies too. And our top pay is $38 an hour, and it's going to take about 7 years from the time somebody starts till they get up to the top pay. We're hoping that will attract more people, more interest, and that we can get up to the staffing levels we need to be at, so that when we do free service, the experience will really be a good one for everyone, and the stress on the organization will not be quite as great.
And that's a universal thing in transportation. Anybody knows anybody who's looking for a good job. I'm sure Debra will talk about this too. Huge need for bus operators, rail operators, mechanics, at every transit agency across the state, every trucking agency across the state. So no, that's an ongoing issue for the people who are trying to keep their systems full and keep them operating. Reliability is huge, obviously, for people who have jobs and rely on the transit for their jobs. They need to make sure, they need to know that that bus is going to show up with a driver, and if there aren't enough drivers, that those routes get cut. So very important. Dan, you do other things to try to minimize the fare impact, to try to make sure that there's equity and make sure everybody has access to transit. One thing you mentioned before we are starting is a bike share program. And obviously different metro areas across Colorado have had some familiarity with that. When are you going to be doing it? What will it look like? And what's the plan?
Well, bike share was implemented by a nonprofit organization called WeCycle in Aspen. I think it was 2012 or 2013. And it gradually has been expanding down the Roaring Fork Valley from Aspen over the past few years. This last year, we developed a 8-party memorandum of understanding with the jurisdictions that are members of RAFTA to provide funding to expand the bike share service beyond Basalt and the Elgin Mid-Valley area down to Carbondale and ultimately to Glenwood Springs. This year, we launched it in Carbondale, and Carbondale Bus Rapid Transit Station is now the #1 system for rides on WeCycle out of something like 87 stations in our region. We're finding out that as we deploy more and more bike share, that the ridership is growing. And we're hopeful that when we deploy it in Glenwood Springs in 2025, that we'll see the numbers really increase, because we're learning that if people can use it to get to transit, make their trip, on the other end they can grab it to get to their job, they're more likely to use it than if they don't have that option at their origin or at their destination. So
Are these e-bikes?
Yeah, we have a combination of e-bikes and pedal bikes. I myself prefer the e-bikes, but and most people do. We're seeing that about 5 or 6 times more rides on about a 50-50 mix of e-bikes and pedal bikes. So that the e-bikes are really preferred. So that's one thing that we're doing. We're also we have a grant program where we're partnering with local communities. Basalt is the first one, where we're helping to share the cost of microtransit services, and we're encouraging the local communities to get some skin in the game, to kind of manage those programs themselves, so we don't have to go through all the procurement process and so forth, which can be kind of a pain, and we can get these things up and running pretty rapidly.
Tell folks, you said microtransit. Tell folks what ideas are for microtransit.
Well, it's a first last mile type of service. It's usually a shared ride, not quite a taxi, more like a van or a van pool service. It can provide some services for people with disabilities, although utilization so far in Basalt hasn't been that great. But it is just getting, the Roaring Fork Transportation Authority is narrow. It's got Highway 82 running down the middle of it. And the communities are offline. And that's one of the reasons that we're successful. But people live long distances, in some cases, a mile, 2, 3 miles, 4 miles away from a bus rapid transit station. So we've looked at the cost of operating fixed route transit services, and it's really, really expensive. But these microtransit services are really cost effective. We're working with a private operator. They have it dialed in, and the service is convenient for people. They have an app, and they can call, and they can go to the store and do internal trips. But our reason for investing in those services is to get people from our bus to their home or from their home to the bus. And so far, it seems to be working well. In Basalt and in Aspen, it's been in operation for about 5-6 years, and the cost per passenger there was like something in the neighborhood of about $8, which is really, really inexpensive.
Well, e-bikes are popular everywhere, and the state's getting involved with some of the money that's been available for some rebates, and it seems like every time anybody opens up a rebate, it sells out very quickly. So tell us what's going on with the state program and whether it has a chance to expand in the future.
Yeah, so the state has 2 e-bike programs. One that is in place right now is an e-bike rebate program. That was funded with a limited amount of one-time funding from the legislature. We have a total of $10 million for rebates, and they're available only to low and moderate income Coloradans. Right now, what we're doing is each month we're essentially opening up an online application process for a week, and then do a lottery among the people who apply. And we'll just keep doing that until we are out of funding. I have to say the response to that's been tremendous. I have no doubt that we are going to spend all $10 million very rapidly. Initially, the legislature allocated it, allowing us to spend it over a period of 5 years. I think it will be spent much more rapidly than that. But last year, the governor signed a bill that is a package of clean energy tax credits that will be in place for a decade. And one of those is an e-bike tax credit. And this will be universal. So any Colorado resident who is a taxpayer will be eligible. It'll be a $500 tax credit. It's structured so that it will actually be delivered through the retailer. So it's not like a tax credit that you need to buy the bike and then get the tax credit when you file your taxes the following year. You'll just get it off of the cost of the bike up front. It's limited to 1 bike per year per taxpayer, and that's uncapped. So that will be, I think, a huge expansion on top of the rebate programs. It's not as much money as low-income residents are typically getting from the state or some of the local government rebate programs, but you won't be in a lottery, and
It saves you from having to wake up at the midnight and press the button at the right time and wonder if you ever got in the line for it. So it's a simpler program.
It's a simpler program, and you're guaranteed access to it.
Right. Okay, so while we're talking rebates, which are hugely popular, and we don't have to talk about our sponsors, but since everybody loves rebates, please visit the XL truck, because car charger rebates, they can talk to you about there, along with our EVs. But Will, you probably don't like this phrase, but this is the one the media uses: cash for clunkers. Yep. Trading in a used car that's fossil fuel, you can get a much higher rebate that really lops the price off a new or used EV if you trade in the older car. So tell us a little bit of the parameters of what that program is. How popular has it proven now that you've opened up applications for it?
Yeah, so Colorado has a number of really, I think, great incentives for folks to switch from gasoline vehicles to electric vehicles. The universal one that's available is a tax credit. It's a $5,000 tax credit for basically all EVs. It doesn't include super expensive ones, but I think it's up to $80,000, so covers most vehicles.
You can't get the Rivian, right?
There's an extra $2,500 for the smaller, less expensive EVs. So we want to really make it easier for folks who might be moderate income to switch to an EV, and want to encourage people to get sort of the smaller cars that have less of an impact and use less battery materials. So if you're buying an EV like a Chevy Bolt, say, or a Nissan Leaf that's under $35,000, there's an extra $2,500 that will be in place starting this next year, so $7,500. There's also the federal tax credit of $7,500 available. But then the Vehicle Exchange Colorado program, the cash for clunkers that you were describing, is really specifically designed for low-income Coloradans who otherwise could have a really hard time getting into an EV. And what it requires is that you have a vehicle that's at least 12 years old or is failing its emissions tests, and that you meet certain income requirements, and then you can get a $6,000 payment towards replacing that with an electric vehicle, and you're able to get that on top of the tax credit. So we really think that it does a lot to improve access to EVs for low-income residents. We opened this up a few weeks ago. We've gotten a lot of applications, like hundreds of applications. We don't know yet, until we've gone through the full vetting, which people will actually qualify, but a number of folks have gone through the full process and gotten a rebate and gotten a vehicle. I think so far a couple of dozen folks. You know, we have a limited amount of funding that has been allocated to this. We allocated $2 million for the initial program, but given the level of uptake and popularity that we're seeing, I think we're going to be taking a look at whether we can bring some more resources to expand it.
Thank you. Danica, maybe you should ask if people have questions. Remember, we have a hard stop at 11:50, only a few minutes left. I see hands raising back there. Yep, great. That's okay. You can say it and I'll repeat it if we need to.
My name is Katie. I live in Boulder, and especially for Mr. Toor. So Colorado is currently planning to adopt a partial version of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule next month, and that means tens of millions more metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions in Colorado's air when compared to the full ACC rule, which I think all the states have adopted at 100%. So how does the state plan on offsetting these excess emissions?
Sure. So just to give a little bit of context here, Colorado currently has a set of clean car standards that require manufacturers, a certain percentage of the vehicles they sell in the state have to be zero emission vehicles, basically electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles. And that current standard is in place through 2025. The level that's required grows each year. What we've seen to date is that given the array of programs that Colorado has to support the EV marketplace, actual EV adoption is way beyond the regulatory requirements. The regulatory requirements sort of set a floor, but they're not actually what's driving EV adoption in Colorado. Like that 13 to 17% that we're in, the regulation right now would require about 4%. What it does is it assures that manufacturers will bring all of their EVs models to Colorado and will be motivated to sell them. We have a rulemaking coming up in about 3 weeks where the Air Commission will consider extending those standards out to 2032. And what it would require is that by 2032, 82% of the vehicles that are sold would have to be zero-emission vehicles. We are not proposing to adopt through 2035, which would essentially be a ban on the sale of gasoline vehicles by 2035, because we don't think that we know enough about the future market at this time to know that every use case that's out there will be an affordable electric vehicle available to replace it. And we don't need to know that now because the rule has the exact same impact over the next decade, whether we adopt it to 2035 or to 2032. So we're going to adopt it, or the proposal, the Air Commission will make a decision to adopt it through 2032, but build in a process in the late 2020s for the Air Commission to reconsider and decide what to do post 2032 based upon what we're seeing in the real world marketplace and whether, what EVs, how the EV market is developing, how we're doing on EV sales, whether there are enough vehicles that can address things like heavy-duty towing that some people have needs to make so that the Air Commission can be comfortable that EVs can really meet those edge cases. But either way, our sense is that once you're at 80% market share, you are on a one-way trip towards full electrification.
Another question here, Terry. So the question was whether there should be a rebate for converting your existing fossil fuel vehicle to electric batteries, as the ones outside have been.
Yeah, so great question. I'm not sure that it's something we've had a lot of discussion of. So would have to think about that one and get back to you.
Okay. Sir?
Full disclosure, I'm not the board of RTD, I know Debra. But do you want to explain why it is a challenge to quickly turn over a fleet to electric vehicles, not just with respect to infrastructure and needing to energize them or zero-emission vehicles, but also in terms of what it takes to remove fleet buses that are current and paid for?
So thank you very much. I think you're talking about our fleet replacement plan, and it's something I touched upon. So recognizing that we basically have a partnership with the Federal Transit Administration, when we utilize federal dollars to procure an asset, there is a requirement that we maintain such asset for 12 years or equivalent to 500,000 miles. For all intents and purposes, as it relates to RTD's current bus fleet, we are not looking at fleet replacement until 2028. More specifically, as it relates to the federal government, in accordance with those specific requirements, there has yet to be any movement as it relates to newer technologies. I can tell you in my previous roles at different organizations, when I've gone in to meet with various members of our then congressional delegation or people that are sitting on Senate Appropriations Committee, and more specifically with the research arm of the Federal Transit Administration, we were advocating to have a shorter period of time as relates to 7 years versus the 12 years with emerging technologies and things of the like. It's very, very challenging. And so as we talk about what it is that we have to do, there's requirements as it relates to disposition of vehicles and things of the like. We can auction those off. So as we talk about conversion to the point that Director Guzman just raised, it has to be intentional, it has to be purposeful, and we have to ensure that we have necessary infrastructure in place and also adequate training as relates to procurement. Dan made mention of that because it can be very arduous when you're utilizing public dollars because we do have a fiduciary responsibility. So as we go forward, recognizing that we have this facilities and fleet transition plan along the way, we have to ensure when we complete said plan and there's recommendations provided by our consultant partner that we actually have facilities that can accommodate what we're looking towards to the future as we talk about thermal runaway fires, as we talk about harnesses and things of the like, contingent upon what that fleet may be comprised of, because I've worked at agencies where we've had a multifaceted fleet, but you also have to have the subject matter expertise. When you think about our organization, we have dedicated employees that have perhaps been diesel mechanics for 25 years, and now we're going to have to retrain them, and they'll have to use different devices to troubleshoot a diagnostic problem, and that's a whole different aspect as we talk about learning and development. So thank you for the question, Director Guzman.
I'm happy to have RTD board members here. That's the point of this conversation this whole day with Sunfest, is to convene conversations and information about policy. Our whole goal at the Colorado Sun is to give people the information they need to make better choices in their own life, to make more contributions to public policy, and to bring you the facts that you need to help make those decisions. So I'm sorry we have a hard stop now. We have a great keynote in here with Connor Hall from the Outdoors Office of the State and Jason Blevins, our great outdoors reporter, right here. So if you can take a minute to get a drink. Thank you to our great panelists for talking about transportation. Obviously, a lot more topics we can hit on. And to make one more thank you to all of you who are members, and a plug for those who are not members yet. That's what the Sun runs on. That's what provides the great journalism. We don't want all your money. We just want most of it. So if you could please consider signing up, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for all your time.